right. Share. All right. So Hollywood in the United States military, look at a cinematic partnership. So I think the first question people would have is, why this? I did say July was partially inspiration for this, rather than just kind of going over, patriotic movies to watch, or my first idea, which was, oh, maybe I could just talk about Independence Day and how great of a movie that is for an hour. But I wanted to actually explore this for two reasons. One, I am a military brat. Both of my parents were in the service. I will not say their branches just for the sake of anonymity. And also due to my age. So I was a teenager and came of age as 9/11 happened in a post 9/11 world. And it also coincided at the time that I was just starting to get more cognizant of what I was watching, what was being shown, how, what messages are being portrayed through film. And that got me, I got interested in this fairly early. So it's always been sort of like with my atomic cinema program, it's been something I have been interested in for a long time. And I actually have to give a lot of credit to a teacher I had in high school, Mr. Fitz, who, a veteran himself, was one of the first to talk about how cinema can really influence our views on things, not just for Americans, but around the world. And he was the first person to clue me into the idea of Hollywood and the US military working together. Because if you remember, post 9/11, the start of the war on terror, the run up to the Iraq war, there was this talking point, and it still exists, I think, that Hollywood and the military are two opposing forces. And he was the first to say, not true at all. They've been working together for, I think at the time it was like been working together for about over 80 years at this point. So we'll get started. So what is the military entertainment complex? That is a term I've seen in a number of academic papers about this. So the best way to describe that would be a reciprocal and a beneficial relationship between Hollywood and the Pentagon, Department of Defense. I'll usually just be referring to it as the DoD. So this includes film, and film is what we'll be discussing, but this also applies to television. And actually, one of the even bigger sort of fields of entertainment getting attention is video games. For a while, they were getting more attention than Hollywood because of how popular video games got. As of right now that we know of, the DoD has helped script or supervise the scripting of over 400 movies. And I've listed a number: Air Force One, Armageddon, Behind Enemy Lines, Bye Bye Birdie, Marvel movies like Captain America, Karate Kid 2, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, military films like Hamburger Hill and the Messenger, The Right Stuff, Silence of the Lambs, that was mainly because of the FBI involvement. Musicals like South Pacific, most recently, Wonder Woman 84. There is a liaison between Hollywood and the DoD. That was Philip Strub, and he was there until 2018. And current head is Daniel Evans. And actually, each branch of the military does have its own liaison service. So there will be the Army, there will be the Marine Corps, and actually, as we'll discuss in a minute, what their standards are can vary. So why would the military want to work with Hollywood? So as I mentioned before, there has been kind of this talking point that like, oh, the Hollywood hates the military because it represents real America, or, none of the actors supported the war on terror or the war in Iraq. But, if you know anything about the film industry, the people who are acting are a small part of it. There are producers, there are people who work in the tech side. There are executives who want to make a lot of money. So one of the big reasons why, budget. So why buy or build tanks or military equipment when you can just utilize equipment that's already here? And actually, some of that applies to older equipment. If you're making a period piece, you would talk to the military and say, hey, do you have something that we can use? Also, people. There are many films where soldiers are extras. And the military will use its hangars and their installations as sets for movies. It happens a lot. And also, kind of a copyright and expertise thing. So there will be many times where it's like, they'll have someone as a consultant to make sure that they're getting it right. There are a lot of, movies, if you're a filmmaker, you do want to have some authenticity. You want to get these films right. And it also kind of, I look at this, I don't look at this as nefarious as some others do. I kind of see it as any copyright holder would. If you're the Air Force, so the example I use is Captain Marvel. If you're the Air Force, you want to make sure that your branch is being portrayed well. As any other person who holds copyright on a product wants to make sure their product is being represented well. So it's something I completely understand. However, if you go through the military to utilize equipment, get some help with sets, or even just have some, assistance on it, they have script approval. So if they don't like something, it's gone. But if creators refuse to change, then they pull out assistance. Actually, an example of this that I'll talk about a little bit more in depth, Independence Day. That was initially going to have military assistance. Military asked if they could change something in the script. Dean Devlin was like, no, it's a lot of our second act. And they said, okay, well then we're gone. So that's why a lot of people pointed out, like a lot of the uniforms are kind of not accurate in Independence Day. It's like, well, they had costume designers do it. And actually an interesting case of each department being a little different in terms of what standards they have is a Clint Eastwood film called Heartbreak Ridge. Clint Eastwood went to the US Army for support because the characters were originally scripted as being Army men. They didn't like the language. Eastwood was like, no, I'm not changing this. He went to the Marines and they provided support, but they just said, okay, these characters are Marines, which, okay, I'm going to say what branch one of my parents was in. My dad was a Marine, and I'm like, oh, that sounds very like something they do. They're like, fine, we'll give you support, but you better make them Marines. And the final reason is recruitment and propaganda. The United States Department of Defense is not above utilizing Hollywood to produce very pro-military or pro-military engagement movies or recruitment tools, as we will see in an example down the line. The one thing I would like to highlight, though, is let's say, the military pulls its assistance or they don't like a script. The film still gets produced. These movies are not suppressed as they are in other countries. China is a good example. If they don't like something, you just don't see it. The producers are still free to make these movies. There is an economic component there where it's like, well, great, now we have to spend more of our own money. But if we're talking about the freedom of expression, that still does exist in this situation. So we're going to talk about the first major collaboration. Does anyone know about the movie Wings? Unless you are a big film buff or an Oscar trivia buff, you probably don't, but it is famous for being the first Oscar winner for Best Picture. There was one movie before that, or big film before that had some military help. And that is the film Birth of a Nation. Just yikes, we all know what that movie is. So West Point provided artillery and technical advice for that movie. But that still was not extremely common then. Wings was more the movie that kind of set the table, set the stage for how this collaboration would work going forward. And also, I don't blame the Department of Defense for not really wanting to talk about working on Birth of a Nation either. The movie has a not great reputation. So this was about two men who were in the Army Air Corps in World War I. The screenwriter approached the War Department for support, and they got it. They filmed it on an airfield. The Air Corps sent planes. They actually had pilots, and the film is actually very groundbreaking for the filming of the air battle sequences. It's worth noting that the director, William Wellman, he was actually a pilot in World War II. A lot of, if you know anything about earlier Hollywood, a lot of those people did do military service. And he, surprisingly enough, did not get along with the military liaisons. He wasn't a fan. He was actually more of a, I want to make my picture. But he also kind of felt, since he had that experience, he's like, why do I need people for expertise? I was there. But again, it's an interesting case, and this sets the stage for future collaborations. But nothing in Wings really compared to what happened in World War II. So funnily enough, September of 1941, about two and a half months before Pearl Harbor happens, the US's involvement in the war begins, Hollywood was accused by a senator named Gerald Nye of producing pro-intervention propaganda. And it's worth noting that while there was some people saying we probably should go help our allies in Europe, there was a very sizable anti-war movement. Some of it was inspired by a lot more odious feelings of anti-Semitism. However, there were many World War I veterans who felt, no, we fought World War I, so we would not have to do this again. So there was an anti-war movement in the United States and an anti-interventionist movement, but there were a number of different factors in terms of its influence. After Pearl Harbor, Hollywood, very willing to participate, make these movies, and it was about morale boosting. So, there were some of these movies were kind of feel-good films. It was like, look at what our boys are doing over there. They're helping save the world. So the Office of War Morale had two agencies to work with Hollywood. The first was the Bureau of Motion Pictures, which was the BMP. They were the script supervisors. They also made educational films. Why We Fight is probably the most famous one. And then the Office of Censorship, which, that's not a great name. They actually dealt more with, as it says, film exports. So what films would be sent overseas? So it wasn't so much, you can't have this content in here. The Office of Censorship was more, ooh, what can we send overseas and what can we not? And some of it was more, we don't want to incite any problems. So FDR appointed Lowell Mellett to the Bureau of Motion Pictures, and he said, quote, the American motion picture is one of the most effective mediums in informing and entertaining our citizens. The motion picture must remain free insofar as national security will permit. I want no censorship of the motion picture. So Mellett tries to stick with that, but he comes into play in a few interesting circumstances in ways that one would not think in World War II, especially post Pearl Harbor. So there's a film called Little Tokyo, USA, and it basically portrayed like this idea of an underground Japanese spy work in the United States, and really had this undercurrent of every Japanese citizen is a potential spy and therefore a potential threat. Mellett felt that the agency had to be more involved after this because he's like, this is an incredibly incendiary movie. This is going to get people hurt. And quote, an invitation to a witch hunt. One, you could argue that is kind of the idea of like how, this is a national security issue at this point because potentially could inflame citizens, or you could look at it as, incendiary content aside, this is still censorship. The other big one was a film called December 7th. And again, this was not due to like, oh, we don't want people to see this secrecy. It was more, oh, this is a very fictional treatment of Pearl Harbor. We need to be as accurate as we can, which is interesting when you look at the Michael Bay Pearl Harbor movie and just how much was fictionalized in that. John Ford, who directed it, did end up editing the film down. 1943, the BMP was shut down and the Office of Censorship just dealt with the movies from now on. It should also be noted at this time, there were a record number of stars and creatives, people from directors to like people working in sound, editors who went enlisted. So John Ford, Frank Capra, this was also the start of USO. So if anything, you can look at the USO as another big partnership between like Hollywood and the military, but that is a discussion for another time. So 1947, this is not quite the military getting involved, it's the entire government getting involved. And if you came to my Atomic Cinema program, I've discussed this movie before. This is the beginning or the end. This is about the Manhattan Project, heavily dramatized, containing a number of inaccuracies. The government got involved. Number one, it dealt with a government project that was fairly secret up until 1945. And at the time, legally required to get permission whenever portraying a known public figure. Actually, no, you still have to do that. So there weren't just military advisors. the whole administration for Truman got involved. Eleanor Roosevelt, who's no longer First Lady, she got involved because initially Lionel Barrymore was cast as FDR. And Barrymore, in his real life, had made some fairly not flattering comments about FDR. And so she was like, I don't want him cast. Eventually, Barrymore was off the project, partially, partially, other opportunities came up. And the main battle, though, wasn't between the Hollywood producers and the military. It was the scientists who were not happy with how they were being portrayed. And there is a great book about this. It came out last year. It's Greg Mitchell's. It's also called The Beginning or the End. The other reason that the government had a vested interest in this was because there was starting to be some panic over the bomb, not in terms of people wondering, should we have dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the idea of like, oh, what are the effects of these? So they were trying to sell America on the bomb being a good thing again. But speaking of bombs, this film was a bomb, and it was largely forgotten with the exception of some film aficionados, although some of the inaccuracies portrayed in that film, such as the Japanese fighter planes attacking the Enola Gay, they survive. I have heard people saying that the Japanese attacked the Enola Gay on that day, and I'm like, no. So it's interesting how a film can be largely forgotten, but some stuff will just live on from it. So we're going to 12 O'Clock High. This is, actually, I asked my dad what movies get the military and military culture right. This was one of the ones that he listed. The other two, he said Saving Private Ryan. He also listed Full Metal Jacket, specifically saying it gets Marine Corps training right. And if you've seen Full Metal Jacket, I don't know how to feel about that one. So 12 O'Clock High, 1949 Gregory Peck film. It's about the Army's 8th Air Force and their work in France and Nazi Germany. Was based on a novel, but these all had real life counterparts. And similar to Wings, the screenwriters in this case were in the military. They had experience in the 8th Air Force. So film had military support. But what's really interesting about this movie is actually, my father's not the only person to think this is a movie that kind of gets it right. And for a while, it was actually for Air Force training, required viewing. So kind of this idea of like, the military will help Hollywood make a film. The military will then utilize that film to help the new people coming in. This film also, for 1949, incredibly groundbreaking, touched on post-traumatic stress disorder, which I think at the time, Todd, correct me if I'm wrong, was that still called shell shock?
At that point, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, but still, it's and that might be why there are a lot of people who look at this film and go, they kind of got it right. Because they talked about stuff that even wasn't being talked about in the larger conversation. So we're going from 12 O'Clock High to Attack. So Attack was a film, full disclosure, was not originally going to be mentioned in this. I had not heard of it, but there is a great website called Spy Culture. And the man who runs it, his whole thing is focusing on the military and Hollywood's relationship. He put in Freedom of Information requests to the DoD to get their notes on films about the military, what they've supported, how they supported it. And one of the ones I looked through was Attack. And it said it was the first major post-war film to not have DoD support. It says the reason why is the plot of the film is about an enlisted man planning on killing his superior. Now that is a big taboo. So I read through more of this document, and that's a reason they have denied funding for a number of movies. The other big one I would say is Apocalypse Now, because that whole plot line. Also Platoon, I don't believe Oliver Stone even requested much help, but that plot line as well, the end of that movie, the final act, that's another one where they're just like, we don't do that. I mean, again, if you know anything about military culture from everything I have heard secondhand, the chain of command is a very almost sacred thing in the military. There is kind of this idea of like, you respect and listen to your officer, barring the most extreme circumstances. So one of those I read and I'm like, ooh, not shocked hearing that. So the director said, he said as well, assistance was refused. He had to buy a tank from Fox, and he also bought one for $1,000. I kind of hoped he got to use it after. I'm like, you own a tank, do something with it. But yeah, so this is, according to DoD documents, the first major post-war movie made about the war to not have funding, and to not just not have it, but to be refused. So we're going on to, you might have heard of this, may not have, the Green Berets, a fairly, I wouldn't even call it famous, it's more infamous than anything else, as an example of propaganda, and also infamous as just not being a very good movie. So this is a film made about the Vietnam War while the Vietnam War was going on. I believe it was released like within months of the Tet Offensive. And it was specifically made to raise support for the Vietnam War. John Wayne was a supporter of the Vietnam War, and he was very worried that people were turning against it. The Vietnam War was also, one second, could someone maybe mute their microphone? I think I'm hearing some feedback. Thank you. Vietnam War was the first real televised war. And so people saw stuff that they wouldn't see in earlier wars. And that led to a lot of people second guessing, should we even be there at this point? So he wanted to make a movie as a tribute to the men that were there, but also really show like, no, it's good that we're here. The film had full cooperation from the Johnson administration, the DoD. The Army did ask for some script changes, but not changes that you would think. One of the changes was when there was a scene of people defending the base camp, they wanted to make sure there were South Vietnamese soldiers helping with the defense, as they wanted to show that the South Vietnamese were also, fighting for their freedom as well. I have seen this film. Funny story, I remember it. I first saw it in freshman year of college, where we were all talking about, films and messaging. And one of my classmates, this was the film he was given to talk about messaging. And he showed it to me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, when was this made? But I remember his presentation to the class and his just really disliking a subplot of, John Wayne befriending a small Vietnamese boy and making fun of the child actors, really bad acting. I did want to include a quote from Roger Ebert. I would highly recommend reading his review because he, I think, verbalizes why this movie doesn't work, more thought out than this, but I really liked this quote. Is offensive not only to those who oppose American policy, but even those who support it. What we certainly do not need is a movie depicting Vietnam in terms of cowboys and Indians. That is cruel and dishonest and unworthy of the thousands who have died there. I mean, I would recommend watching the Green Berets because I think it is a good example of probably the closest the United States really has to, I would say, propaganda being pushed through Hollywood. But it is not an interesting watch. It's more, or a fun watch. It's more of a curio, if anything. Or if even John Wayne fans are like, this is for John Wayne completists only. We're moving on to a better war movie, though. Patton, starring the great George C. Scott, written by Coppola. And this was a movie you would think right out of the gate had support from the DoD. Initially, no. Rejected. The reason was they were like, is it too soon to make a movie? And there was also, Patton's family members, including one of his sons, who I think was in the armed services at that time, were really opposed to this. I think, number one, it was a kind of he hadn't been dead for that long, but the other one was, there was this idea that Hollywood is not good to the military. This was kind of going around Vietnam. This is around the same time MASH had come out, and a lot of actors were protesting and speaking out against the Vietnam War. Eventually, especially after looking at the script, they're like, the Army cooperated. They also had cooperation from the Spanish Army, and they still had World War II equipment, so that helped them out a lot. They didn't have to build new props. And filming ended up taking place in Spain. The Spanish Army gave them tanks and troops, in the United States let them film on one of their bases. But this is a really interesting case of one where you think it'd be a no-brainer that the Army would support this, but actually due to a lot of other hesitations, kind of took them a while to come around on. So speaking of Vietnam, Vietnam on film. So we kind of talked about a little bit with the Green Berets. Post-Vietnam, so late 70s into the 80s, very interesting in terms of what the output was. A lot more introspective, reflective films, some films that were very just vocally anti-war. I think Platoon would probably be the best example of that. Again, Vietnam was the first time America had the war really, truly just beamed into their television sets. And it led to years of protests. It led to a lot of people who went and fought coming home and feeling like their own country didn't support them anymore. But we did have films that gave us, I think, a more complicated look at war and combat. I mean, it's a really, it's very different from World War II, which I think a lot of people looked at and they're like, how can you not fight that war? It's a just cause. Vietnam, from how it started to how it ended to what we did over there, is far more complicated. And we also had, evidence of things like the My Lai massacre. Again, complicated, I think, is probably the most diplomatic way to describe it. The deer hunter is interesting. Cimino really didn't want military assistance. The Ohio Film Bureau did, but Cimino was like, I'm not making any of these changes. But that's a movie that gets considered to be like a great anti-war film, but it's also called pro-war propaganda due to its torture scenes. My teacher, Mr. Fitz, not a fan of the deer hunter. He was mainly due to those torture scenes. But I believe Cimino himself was like on the record of, not quite an anti-war movie, but he's like, I wanted to show what that war did to people. Platoon is based on Oliver Stone's experience. DOT, I looked through those documents, very unhappy with the stuff that is portrayed in that film. Actually, my teacher, that was a movie he liked because for him, that was very close to his experience. He went in the early 60s thinking we were supposed to be there and just came back completely disillusioned and wondering what we were. So I think, if anything, these are movies that are a very good example of different films will speak to different experiences, and that potentially, like, there really is, I think, no one experience that fits everybody, especially not if you've been to combat. Casualty of War, which if you've never seen, it is a great film directed by Brian De Palma, starring Michael J. Fox in one of his few dramatic roles, based on an actual incident. It is a very rough watch. That's one De Palma didn't even bother to try to get assistance. Kubrick refused assistance for Full Metal Jacket, but he did film on British bases. There are films like Bat 21 and Hamburger Hill. They kind of follow the more World War II model. But even then, they kind of try to address some of the complexities of Vietnam. I think, however, the most interesting case, and Todd, you've kind of pointed this out about the series, is Rambo, or specifically the 1982 film First Blood. So if you, how many people here are familiar with Rambo? Just the whole series? You put in the chat, I'm assuming most people are. You're probably more familiar with it from First Blood Part 2, and John Rambo as like this rampaging machine soldier. But if you've seen First Blood, the one with Richard Crenna in, oh God, Todd, why am I blanking out his name?
Which one, Brian Dennehy or?
Thank you, Brian Dennehy, thank you. Brian Dennehy, Sylvester Stallone. John Rambo he's a Vietnam vet, but he's a drifter. He's just passing through. He wants to keep to himself. He's really not interested in being a martyr or a symbol. He gets kind of forced into that role. Versus you see First Blood Part 2, where he goes on a mission to find POWs, and there is a line that, "Sir, do we get to win this time?" If you watch Rambo 3, very famously dedicated to the Mujahideen. It's the Mujahideen, right, Todd?
Well, there's some debate over where that title card is actually legitimate or not, but the fact is the movie is still Rambo helps what will become the Taliban. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Okay, actually, thank you for correcting me on that. But yeah. So if you and then there's Rambo 4 and 5. But what started out as I think a commentary on how the veterans felt post Vietnam, feeling like they didn't really have a place in this society, to the kind of guns ablazing Rambo we know now. It's a really interesting example of a franchise just doing a 180. But we are going to move on to, I would say, probably of all the films we discussed, the movie that truly changed everything, and that is Top Gun. Top Gun, I mean, it was the biggest film of 1986. It was the biggest movie of the summer. It had a great soundtrack, although I'm pretty sure Take My Breath Away beat out Somewhere Out There for best song at the Oscars, so I'm always going to hold that against it. But this is the movie that kind of made the military cool again, and it gave the military kind of a way out of the funk that Vietnam left them in. So if you have not seen Top Gun, this is about a bunch of hotshot naval aviators and a volleyball scene that everybody knows about. Based on a 1983 article about these fighter pilots, also heavily dramatized, produced with a ton of assistance from the Navy. At the time, like unheard of, $1.8 million for use of naval air station planes, aircraft. Very involved with the script. One of the changes, which does not shock me at all, there's a dogfight. It was supposed to be Cuba. They're like, no, we're doing international waters. But one of the things it did was it made the Navy seem cool. And they actually saw an increase in people showing interest in joining up in the recruitment. So they saw this like, oh, this is what we can do. We can make us cool again. And there was a great line from a Time magazine article from November 24th, 1986. It says, there we are. The partnership has been profitable for both Hollywood and the Pentagon. Top Gun, which has raked in $160 million, keep in mind 1986 money, so far at the box office, is the year's highest grossing film. Its glorified portrayal of Navy life spurred theater owners in such cities as Los Angeles and Detroit to ask the Navy to set up recruiting exhibits outside cinemas where Top Gun was playing to sign up the young moviegoers intoxicated by the Hollywood fantasy. Which again, at the end of the day, fun as a movie as it is a fantasy. Another poll quote from this is, can't find it, I'm sorry. The combination of Top Gun's box office success and America's current mood of gung-ho patriotism has sent studios scrambling to produce war movies. The Pentagon is currently reviewing more than 200 screenplays, says LA-based Navy liaison officer Sandra Stairs. Quote, I have seen 10 times more scripts now than in the previous 2 years. Each of the four services, as well as the Coast Guard, maintains going on to maintain a liaison, but the Pentagon, quote, couldn't buy the sort of publicity films give us. And that is from the special assistant for audiovisual media. That's Donald Baruch. You could actually find this on our EBSCO databases, but this is the movie that kind of, I think, showed the military where to go with this partnership. And I would say more than any other film discussed, this is the one that changed the game. So we're moving on to the 90s, to GoldenEye. You might wonder, why would the military care about a movie about James Bond? Isn't he British? Well, James Bond films, with Hollywood, they did start to kind of work the United States in more as the film franchise developed. And as a lot of other movies, it's like, hey, let's save some money, get some military support to utilize some equipment, maybe a base overseas or something. This was the change. And I again want to shout out the great website Spy Culture and for doing this work. The Pentagon really just requested one big change. There is the character of an easily duped admiral. He was supposed to initially be an American soldier. Pentagon's like, yeah, can you just change them to be Canadian or something? We don't want that. I think they just said anyone for it, but they just said, this makes us look bad. And I guess I find it very interesting that that they would care about something so small, but as I said earlier, like everyone else, they are putting out an image by utilizing Hollywood, and it's not a good image if they look stupid. So this was a note from Philip Strubb, quote, "We appreciate your changing the identity of the U.S. Admiral to a foreign officer, and you're including dialogue recognition identifying the Marines." So actually, I want to take a quick break because speaking of reasons assistance has been rejected or changes that have been made, that big DoD FOIA request had a lot of interesting rejections for movies. I'd like to read a few. This is from Starman, a 1984 John Carpenter film. Quote, these are all just rejections. There was nothing of positive nature for services, especially the Air Force. Approval was denied. As often the case with sci-fi pictures, the military became the villain trying to capture the nice alien and dissect him or something like that. Honestly, whoever wrote these, I kind of want to meet them because they're sassy. I like them. The Stand, not the current one that came out, which I heard was also terrible, the 1994 miniseries for ABC. Quote, requested use of military equipment and installations for ABC TV miniseries based on Stephen King novel of the same name. Letter from production manager read, in part, that the producer hoped that the nature of the story, which depicted the Army accidentally releasing a gas that almost kills everyone in America, would not deter the DoD from favorably considering his request for assistance. Declined assistance. Broken Arrow. Renegade Air Force pilot steals 2 nuclear weapons to sell to the highest bidder. Obviously, no way the Air Force would help on such a portrayal. Close Encounters. Studio wanted use of a large hangar in which to film the final sequence and the alien ship lands. Air Force refused to assist on the grounds that it had denied the existence of UFOs or aliens, so it could not be appropriate to cooperate. So, I am the first person to say that the military is saying UFOs are real is like, guys, UFO means a different thing to them than it does to us. It doesn't immediately mean aliens. But that line of it's denied the existence of UFOs or aliens, so it's not appropriate to cooperate. I'm like, oh, is there something we should know here? And then the final one before we move on, which I found funny and more really wanted to just be a fly on the wall of this room. For Apocalypse Now, Coppola came into Pentagon with a script that he said had no ending yet. I'm not shocked. But wanted help. Since the script called for termination of one officer by another, the Army always refused to consider assistance. Despite subsequent efforts, the DoD did not answer. Telegram to President Carter, which marked the end of communications on film. The entire file is copied and now at the Georgetown University Library. Again, that's another one where I want some more information on this. Did they have to ask Jimmy Carter to say, can you tell Francis Ford Coppola to leave us alone? Or did Jimmy Carter personally just tell Coppola, like, please leave the military alone. They're not helping you. But again, would love to be a fly on the wall for that. So Saving Private Ryan came out in 1998. That was actually the highest grossing film in America of that summer, whereas Armageddon was the worldwide. And I think at least over 1,000 films have been made about World War II. US and abroad, some are kind of cheesy, some are really, I think, great. I would put Saving Private Ryan up there as one of the best. And those films, the World War II movies, the ones made during the war, that was really to increase morale. That was to, try to show the audiences at home what the troops were doing over there, but also assure them, we're doing the right thing. Keep up the hope. Keep up the morale. And there was a resurgence of this in the 90s. I've heard some more cynical interpretations as to why, such as the Cold War was done. We needed to drum up military support. For me, I think the more obvious answer and the more likely one was the fact that veterans and survivors of the Holocaust were starting to pass away. So there was this idea of, we need to remind people of what happened, the sacrifices people made there. I think one of the reasons that World War II also, kind of endures, and other people have written about this as well, is that World War II is it was the last war again with a very clear justification. And we were without a doubt the good guys in this situation. I don't even think that should be in quotes. We were the good guys. I mean, the other people were fascists, and there's no such thing as a good fascist. But one of the things I have noticed about American films about World War II is they will sometimes overemphasize American involvement and kind of downplay the involvement of other countries, most notably the Soviet help that we had. Cold War beyond, we were not their friends, but the Soviets were integral in defeating Germany. We tend to kind of not downplay that. And I kind of, it's always been something where it's like, we always have to be the heroes of the story rather than a hero of the story. And that definitely comes into play with World War II movies, even Saving Private Ryan, which again, is a movie that for the most part gets it right. That has received criticism for the fact that they make Normandy into almost a completely American operation when in truth there were troops from other countries there. But I mean, I don't think that takes away from Saving Private Ryan being a fantastic film. So we're coming up on the turn of the millennium. I think you know what we're working towards. Interesting case is 13 Days. So made in year 2000, starring my mom's nemesis, Kevin Costner. She just isn't a fan of him. My dad took her to see JFK and she's like, worst movie I've ever seen. About the Cuban Missile Crisis. DOD allowed for the shooting of bases. They utilized the Philippines, which doubled for Cuba. Obviously, if you know anything about our history of Cuba, we're not going down there to shoot anytime soon. So the film was, critiqued well for being a good movie, but was critiqued for historical inaccuracy, specifically for the portrayal of Kenneth O'Donnell. And Ernest May, who wrote the book that was the basis for the film, had an essay critique of the movie, and he actually claimed that the military was misrepresented, or the top brass, to be more aggressive than they actually were. And so one would wonder, if the military, especially if you read through all these DOD things, they talk about accuracy and what we would or wouldn't do. It's interesting that the DOD would sign off on something that portrays them in what could potentially be seen as a less flattering light. Could it be that they're like, no, it's fine as long as they see us as tough? Or was it something where they saw as like, well, this is a story that needs to be told, let's just write it off? I do always tend to think that the most obvious answer is probably that. But I do think this is, again, an interesting case of you were okay with inaccuracy, especially in a way that made you seem, probably for moviegoers, more unflattering. Actually, a fun postscript to this, though, is Kevin Costner went to Cuba and screened this for Fidel Castro, which I'm like, oh no, the DOD would not be a fan of that. I kind of wonder what, again, once again, would love to be a fly on the wall for that conversation. Black Hawk Down, probably I would say the most justified case of a change I could find. So if you're unfamiliar with what this movie is about, it's about the 1993 in Mogadishu in Somalia. This is during the Somali Civil War. US soldiers were sent in to abduct lieutenants of Mohammed Farah Adid. I hope I said that right. Mission goes wrong. The helicopter is down. The soldiers are pretty much in a standoff until they're rescued. Army provided equipment, training, they allowed them to meet the people they were portraying. So there is one person who is absent here, and that is a man by the name of John Stebbins. He is in the, or his counterpoint is in the movie as just a man named John Grimes. Ewan McGregor portrays him. So the reason John Stebbins is not in this film is because in 1999, 2 years before this film comes out, he is convicted via court-martial of sexual assault of his young daughter. And the author of that book, Mark Bowden, the initial book of which the movie is based, said that the Pentagon requested that change. The studio said, like, no, he's just an amalgamation of other people. Bowden is like, no, they specifically said change the man's name. I think the New York Post covered it. I know that his ex-wife was still unhappy because it's like he's somehow profiting off of this. But I think this is actually a case where the change is best, because if they kept that name in, it would be a worse look for the film. He probably would then get some kind of payment. I think if they don't utilize your name, you actually can't really claim it's you or something. Actually, I think because he was court-martialed, he probably isn't entitled to any. I know when you're court-martialed, you lose a lot of things in terms of benefits, but this is one where I completely understand where the Pentagon is coming from. And also, if you're making a film that is about people trying to survive in a bad situation, why would you want the awful actions of one person to overshadow that of everyone else involved? So this is one, there was like a little bit of clamor about it. Probably not that much because the internet wasn't what it was now. I do wonder what the reaction would be if it were to come out now. There'd probably be a bigger deal, or that, or people would just be like, yeah, change his name, don't have him in this movie. But this is one where I look at that and I'm like, no, 100% get why you made that change. And frankly, I kind of would too if I were in that situation. So Black Hawk Down came out in December of 2001. I think we all know what happened in September of 2001. September 11th completely changing the course of this country's history, the largest terrorist attack in the United States. What we didn't hear a lot about afterwards was the fact that the Pentagon had a meeting with Hollywood, directors, producers, screenwriters. And it was, about like, some of it was, what can we do? It was brainstorming future terrorism scenarios. Some of that was because 9/11 was so out of left field. It was not what anyone had imagined a terrorist attack would be. People imagined it more in terms of Timothy McVeigh's attack on Oklahoma City. I think they were like, can you think of something more out of left field so we could potentially plan for this? But there was also meetings about how can we sell the global war on terror, not just to the United States, but abroad. And, as it goes without saying again, 9/11 changed everything. But one of the things it really changed in cinema was there was now a villain. If you watch a lot of films from the Cold War, the Russians, or the Soviets at the time, were just a consistent villain. If you watch a lot of movies in the 90s, we have aliens, we have, that really god-awful Godzilla movie. We have giant asteroids, 2 in 1 year, if you're looking at Deep Impact and Armageddon. We had volcanoes, we had natural disasters. It was almost like we were kind of trying to figure out who could be the next big bad. And with 9/11, Hollywood's like, well, great, now we have a new big bad. So again, it's something that they kind of utilized to their favor, and the government did as well. So there were some films that were actually moved back. We all know that there were movies that were edited, the Twin Towers were removed and whatnot. Collateral Damage, a movie that actually got some flack for being a reactionary film to 9/11, to which I would say, please, people, know how long it takes to make a movie. Movies aren't made this quickly. That actually had its release date moved back because the subject matter was about a man whose family dies in a terrorist attack. It was just more of a really not great timing. But then there were other movies like Paul Greengrass's The Bourne Identity. The original draft of that script, the CIA is a more menacing figure. And in the 90s, we were almost kind of okay with, with movies like Enemy of the State. The idea of the government potentially not being all great, or there being a faction in there that is sinister. We were okay with that. Post 9/11, that went away. So Bourne Identity, CIA is definitely less villainous than it was in the first draft. Interestingly enough, the films that dealt with 9/11 directly, namely Oliver Stone's World Trade Center in United 93, they really opted to try to be as apolitical as they humanly could, probably because they didn't want controversy. United 93, which I would actually recommend watching. I think it is probably the best film made about 9/11. The initial end card to that film was America's War on Terror had begun, and this was in like the pre-screenings. There were a lot of critics were like, this seems a little propagandistic. Paul Greengrass changed that to a dedication instead. And still, almost, it's going to be 20 years out. You still can't escape the imagery of 9/11 in a lot of action films. Man of Steel, I think, is a really horrifically good example of just how the images of that day have become just burned into our psyche and are kind of filtered via pop culture. But again, sort of another like big game changing moment. 9/11 in the with 9/11, Hollywood and the military worked together closer than they ever had, which again kind of runs really counter to if you watched a lot of TV at that time or listened to pundits, this idea that Hollywood and the military are two like opposing forces. They might have been in terms of what people who were acting was saying, but in terms of behind the scenes, they work together very closely. And no better franchise is a better example of that than the Transformers franchise. The military loved this movie. In fact, they actually started providing assistance before the script was even approved. So a little background on this. In order for a movie to get assistance, they have to submit their scripts first to get approval. The Pentagon was just like, nope, this sounds great. This is fine. You can use all the air equipment you want. And again, it's, you know, it's got some interesting firsts in there. It filmed at Air Force bases and it actually filmed at the Pentagon, which first movie to do that after 9/11. Clearly, after 9/11, the Pentagon wasn't letting a lot of people in there who didn't need to be in there. And it utilized equipment that hadn't been seen on screen before, which, you know, the military does like to keep some of its equipment fairly hidden. It's a for your eyes only, or you have to be enlisted to see it. One of the reasons that the military saw this movie, these series, as a good opportunities, the global market was becoming a lot more important post 9/11. And in Transformers, for like the military is they're good guys. And this is during the global war on terror. So this is kind of an opportunity for the United States military to kind of boost its image, not just at home, but abroad. So I mentioned before that the DoD is not above making propaganda. And I believe there is no better modern example of that than this film called Act of Valor, which was a big hit, 2012. The whole marketing, if anyone remembers the marketing campaign for this, it was all about starring real life Navy SEALs, which, you know, there were some other Navy SEALs who weren't happy about this because one of their big things is you're not supposed to talk about what you do on the job. You're supposed to keep a low profile. You're not supposed to brag about what you do. But this actually, not surprisingly, began its life as a recruitment ad. And was decided, let's expand this to a film. And it's all about just these Navy SEALs, they're on a mission. But I keep going back and wondering, I'm like, if any other country did this with like their elite military, what would we say? If China did this with their military, would we go see it? Or would we be like, this seems a little off? As Roger Ebert put it, it's gift-wrapped, it's in patriotism. It was once intended as a recruitment film, and that's how it plays. I don't believe it had the same effect that, say, Top Gun had. I think it helped more just kind of reinforce this idea that Navy SEALs are the baddest guys in the block. It's also interesting because it came out around the time that there were a lot of documentaries that were, again, a little bit more either critical or at least reflective. The Messenger, actually a great movie I'd recommend watching. Documentaries like Restrepo, The Tillman Story, which is, if you're not familiar with Pat Tillman, that was he was a football player, had a contract to go into the NFL, turned it down to enlist in Afghanistan, and when he was killed, there was a fair amount of myth making about him. And when it came out how he died later, that really sort of deflated the image that had been creative of him. And his family is heavily involved with the making of the Tillman Story documentary. But you almost look at this film, Act of Valor, as kind of counter programming to this, you know, people wondering, like, why are we still in Iraq? Why are we still in Afghanistan? It's hard to not look at that as, for me personally, someone looking at this movie, as something trying to go, no, it's still great, join up. Oh, there we are. Zero Dark 30. So the other 2012 movie, Catherine Bigelow's film, follow-up to The Hurt Locker, which actually Hurt Locker did not get DoD approval, as they put it, had it initially, didn't want to make script changes, and DoD said, okay, fine, make your movie, but we're not a part of it. This is about the assassination of Osama bin Laden, and it did have help from the CIA. Tom Seckert's Spy Culture has a lot of good information on this. Again, it's amazing what he gets via FOIA. There were some people, like Representative Pete King, as I mentioned, he thought they had too much help, to the point where it's like, did you give the makers of this film classified information? Because that is something, military assistance is not supposed to do. It is not supposed to give stuff to civilians that civilians should not see. Another interesting story of this is Mark Bowl, the screenwriter. He just heard about a classified awards ceremony, and he managed to get in and attend. And it was honoring the people involved with the bin Laden raid. There are, again, looking over the documents in terms of what was changed, one of the notes was an interrogation scene that involved the use of a dog. They're like, we would never do that. They were, however, okay with the torture scenes, and the torture scenes did have a lot, received a lot of criticism. The acting director at the time was not a fan of it. We're probably still aware, torture is still something that has a lot of debate for people. There are people in the services who are like, we don't do that, we shouldn't. And there's other people who say, hey, if we need to get what we want. Then there's a lot of people saying it doesn't work to begin with. That's a discussion for another day. There was criticism over this film because if the way it almost portrays torture as working in this case, which wasn't entirely true to what actually happened. And again, I would highly recommend checking out Spy Culture's work on this. They were just an amazing source for this program for me. So going to kind of, I almost wish Act of Valor was the one that followed this, because American Sniper, to me, is an example of propaganda, but not for the military itself. So if you're not familiar with Chris Kyle, he is a deceased Navy SEAL. He touted himself as the deadliest sniper in American history. He always touted his kill count, a kill count that was disputed by the Navy. And he had a book that was a bestseller before his death. And 2014, a film starring Bradley Cooper, directed by Clint Eastwood, comes out, becomes a box office smash. Had a lot of SEALs on it, advisors, actually some SEALs act in the film. And Chris Kyle is, while for, I would say, civilians, there was a point in time where he was just Chris Kyle war hero before it came out that, the Navy was like, that kill count isn't what we have on record. And he's not seen as a, all-around hero. There are similar to Act of Valor, there are a lot of people who are like, you don't talk about your service, you don't brag. There are some who, I'm not going to say who are like, he makes us look bad because he again, I'm just going to quote, he makes us look like psychopaths who enjoy killing people. There's also the issue that his biography has a lot of things that can't be fact-checked and don't make sense. One of the more famous stories of his was like, oh, I was sniping people during Hurricane Katrina. There's no evidence of that, including there's people like, he wasn't even in New Orleans at that time. This isn't he's making this up. The other one was he was the proverbial good guy with a gun and ended up shooting 2 people. And people are like, okay, well, where's any police record of this? And he just wrote it off as saying, oh no, I just talked to the cops and it was fine. Which again, in reality, even if it is justified, even if it is self-defense, there's going to be a police record of it. So there was starting to be some is Chris Guy, is the image he's selling what he actually is. And then the movie comes out and kind of knocks that all aside. Although I think after the movie died down, people started talking about that again. So overall, I think American Sniper, not propaganda for the United States military. I think the most thing it could be considered is propaganda for Chris Kyle's image, in the image that his family is now putting out. But it's an interesting, for me, a case study in modern American myth making. Sort of this idea of, we're going to take someone who was a human being who had flaws. I mean, Chris Kyle might be someone who liked to make up these stories about himself, but he was also, by all accounts, a very devoted husband and a loving father. And just making them into these, unblemished martyrs, who would, embody everything we need about America. And again, I don't even think it'd be fair to put this as military propaganda as much as it is propaganda for his image. We're getting to the end. Independence Day resurgence. So I'd mentioned first Independence Day didn't get military funding. The reason is, according to Dean Devlin, I listened to the commentary. I actually found that quote, and I wish you talked about it more. They just said, hey, you got too much Area 51 stuff in here. Can you get rid of it? And he's just like, this is the entire second half of our film. We're not. So pulled out funding. They had a lot of the planes we're seeing there, they're digitized. They're not real. And actually, Resurgence didn't have help assistance filming it either. But what assistance they did have was the Army teamed up with Fox to kind of do advertising and recruiting. And what they did was, in Independence Day Resurgence, it's 20 years later. It's a bad movie, honestly, don't watch it. There's only one Independence Day. But in this film, there's now an Earth space defense. So they basically, the Army made these ads about Earth space defense and saying, come learn more. And when someone would click on that online, it would direct them to actual positions in the United States Army. This campaign cost $2 million. Again, this is what one of those looked like. Where do you see the U.S. Army recruiting thing? It's way on the bottom. You would almost miss it. Again, just it's an interesting case of they're going beyond just helping out with the film and saying, hey, this could actually help us recruit people. Really trying to kind of, I think, recreate that Top Gun magic. So coming to the end, probably other than the Transformers movies, the biggest partnership that the military has with Hollywood right now is with the MCU. And they've helped them out since Iron Man. The first MCU movie, Iron Man, is an interesting one because there are critiques of like the military industrial complex and war profiteers and weapons manufacturers. But as these movies go forward and as they just completely engulfed our pop culture, the Department of Defense is like, ooh, we really shouldn't be adversaries or standing by. We should be allies. We should be friends. And in some cases, it's more, it's just, there's an obvious reason why they'd help them. Captain America was in the armed services, Captain Marvel as well. She was in the Air Force. And if you want to utilize those images, you're going to have to ask them for help. But as it's gone on, they've gone more for being almost adversaries and antagonists to their friends. If anyone watched the show WandaVision, Randall Park's character is like, a good government agent. And I think one of the more egregious examples is Martin Freeman's CIA agent character in Black Panther. Few people pointed out, they're like, in real life, the CIA agent would be trying to immediately destabilize Wakanda. Not help him made to become a sovereign nation. If you know anything about our history in the Middle East and Latin America, there's the reason people pointed that out, that a CIA agent helping a country remain sovereign and without U.S. influence is extremely unrealistic. But it's subtle. It's not as rah military as, say, the Transformers movies are, but the subtle partnership between the two, and again, these are movies that are seen around the world. It's kind of putting that idea out there. It's like, no, we're here to help, rather than, depending on what country you live in, depending on where you live, the United States military might not always be seen as a good presence. So kind of to finish it off, these are good questions to ask ourselves, no matter what movie you're watching, is sort of, what are the views of this movie? I think having your thinking cap on, having your brain turned on to be like, am I being sold something, is not bad, no matter what you're watching, what you're reading. It's always good to wonder, is there an agenda here? But I think specifically in terms of this, how can these affect our views? How does this affect our view of history? We saw with the beginning or the end, inaccuracies can kind of live on even after the film has left the cultural consciousness. How can it influence our world affairs? Karl Rove in the White House was like, how can Hollywood help us sell the war on terror? Whether a war is just or not. Look at Platoon dealing with the Vietnam War versus the Green Berets. Whether being in the military is a responsibility. Both of my parents have always been of the opinion of the military is not for everyone. You shouldn't be forced to go, and you shouldn't go in because you're not sure what to do with your life, because this is a commitment and a responsibility to your country. Or if it's fun, like, Top Gun, or, a kid somewhere else in the world seeing the military help the good guys out in, let's say, Captain Marvel. They're like, oh, the Air Force is good because Captain Marvel was in the Air Force. Again, ultimately, I think, be it the military or other things, it's always good to kind of wonder, like, how is this affecting how I view things? I mean, again, I will credit both of my parents for giving me, good critical thinking skills. And that's probably why I found this topic to be incredibly interesting. And I also think that, we live in a country where we can at the very least openly talk about and question these things, which is something that not everyone else in the world has. So we're moving on to questions. I'm going to stop the share. Stop share. All right. Oh no, someone had low battery. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, you can all get off mute. Actually, I'll go through the chat. One second. Oh, someone said was a television show as well. Kevin, what were you referring to? Is it MASH?
12 O'Clock High was a television show, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I'm almost positive I remember it being on television, not the movie, but it was a television show.
No, that was one where I asked my dad, and he said these were the 3 films he thought did it the best. Although, if you've ever seen Full Metal Jacket, specifically the military training, I'm like, oh, geez, are you okay? Well, Arlie Ermy, so Kubrick, as I said, didn't want US funding. I mean, if you know anything about Stanley Kubrick, this is a man who will make you do a take 10 times, like, no, not 10, let's say 70 times. He likes to do his own thing. I could definitely see him being like, I don't want any kind of involvement. But Arlie Ermy, he hired of his own accord, and Arlie Ermy kind of had input in terms of what's accurate, what isn't. And he's like, yeah, no, screaming in their faces is something we do.
It was for 3 years. It was on television. I just Googled it. It was 3 years. It was on television.
Oh, well, look at that.
Yeah.
Someone said, trying to go back up here. I watched Patton and MASH all in one sitting. My backside was numb afterwards. Yeah, those are 2 movies. Okay, so, yep, people have heard of the Rambo series. Did the Canadians have anything to say about their portrayal? I didn't see it. Tom Secker's Spy Culture did not mention it. I don't know if it's because they are just not, they aren't as sensitive, but, the United States military is the biggest military on the planet. They have a PR department, and they have PR to worry about, whereas I don't think a lot of other countries do. There is, an image they want to maintain that and that also goes back to military culture. Like my parents will tell me, like, there is, especially for officers, a code of conduct in a way in which you are supposed to conduct themselves. So you could look at the GoldenEye thing as, oh, they don't want us to be seen as stupid. But from a military perspective, it could be like, what kind of a soldier would do that? Like, we're not supposed to conduct ourselves this way. Like, they almost see it as you're portraying us inaccurately, not just you're making us look dumb. But I don't think Canada really cared. So thank you, Liz. Oh, 2 films not mentioned: Longest Day and Tora Tora Tora. Longest Day I considered. I just couldn't. It was more, I was trying to find an interesting angle to it, and that was just one more. I'm like, it's fairly
factual.
Yeah, and it's fairly standard in terms of what the conditions were, and what the the DOD didn't make them change anything, or it was pretty standard. Whereas I thought 12 O'Clock High, I'm like, oh, I really wanted to mention it because my dad said it gets it right. And I also thought the inclusion of PTSD for film in 1949 was, I think, a fairly groundbreaking movie. Plus the fact that it was shown in Air Force training for years afterwards. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Tora 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 as well. Tora 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 is going to come up in a program in the future. We're looking at March to talk about Akira Kurosawa and his involvement with that. But that was another case of just like, there was an interesting story there, but it didn't quite fit in terms of the military in Hollywood. The story there is, Todd would know more about this, is Kurosawa just not really, not even not getting along with military brass. It's more just he was
battling some demons of his own at the time.
Yeah, that's for the, but yeah, those are 2 movies, especially Longest Day, I had considered, but I more wanted to highlight in stuff where it was interesting specifically to this topic. Like for me, I'm still wondering why the Pentagon was okay with an inaccurate portrayal in 13 Days. I would just gather it's probably more they're like, it's not worth it. Who cares?
Actually, one comment I had on that with regards to the MCU discussion, Black Panther is kind of an interesting one for that, because on the one hand, yes, you have the kind of heroic CIA character. Then they also have the fact they make it very clear Killmonger was basically taught to be the way he is by the U.S. government.
It is, but again, then I'm like, well, then how do you square the circle of having the CIA there?
Yeah, it's kind of one where it's like, one of these feels like it was a peace offering, and I'm not sure which it was.
Yeah. There was one other one I almost wanted to talk about more. I think it was Apocalypse Now, but I folded that all into Vietnam. But yeah, Apocalypse Now, similar to Attack and Platoon, one of the biggest taboos you can have in military culture is really going against your superior officer. Actually interesting. So I asked if anyone saw The Last Jedi. This is going to get really nerdy. One of the big contention points was, why didn't Laura Dern's character just tell Oscar Isaac's character what the plan is? And I'm like, well, in the military, your job, if your superior isn't telling you anything, is to just say, okay, well, I guess I'm waiting for orders. So I asked my mom, who, in her branch got up to a pretty high-ranking officer position. I explained this, and she goes, oh, no, that's absolutely true. Depending on the superior officer you have, they will tell you the plan is you sit down and shut up and wait for me to give you an order, especially if you'd recently been demoted, as Oscar Isaac's character had. Some of it was just seeing like the continuously things that they reject. I think the fact that aliens keep getting rejected kind of stuck out to me too. I'm like, wait a minute, because there has been the whole kerfuffle of the Air Force saying like, oh yeah, we've seen UFOs, which for the military, UFOs means what it says. It's an unidentified flying object. It could be a craft, could be a drone, it could be a bird. They're like, we don't know what this is. Pop culture, in popular culture or just regular civilian culture, we hear UFO, we think aliens. And I've been kind of one of the like, I'm going to burst your bubble and tell you, no, guys, the military isn't admitting aliens are real. Stop it. But the fact that there are so many instances of them going like, we keep telling people aliens aren't real, we can't be involved in this. That's when I go, but why? Is this, or is it just because you're like, we have to maintain, again, the more likely thing, we have to maintain consistency here. We can't say aliens aren't real and participate in these movies. But then there's sort of wonders, are you not participating in these movies because there's something else there that we don't know about? But I don't know. But you are correct. Longest Day and Tora 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 are great. I would say definitely Longest Day, a better John Wayne Moore movie by a country mile.
What about the best years of our lives? Did you consider talking about that at all or no?
I did. Some of it is also time. Unfortunately, we were open until 8:30 again. Potentially, I could have. Best years of our lives. So the book that I referenced for the World War II slide, Five Came Back. They talk about what Best Years of Our Lives initially was. It was a much darker screenplay, and I believe it became a book. The person who wrote the original screenplay wrote a book about it, or the book was written first, but it was much darker initially. But yeah, best Years of Our Lives, another kind of with 12 O'Clock High, groundbreaking in terms of it looked at the realities of, oh geez, what am I trying? I'm blanking on something. The realities of what soldiers faced coming back then.
Oh, yeah. Frederick March comes back, and you could basically he's an alcoholic, but they really didn't show that. I mean,
oh, definitely not. And he won Best Supporting Actor, but he has, you know, he had lost his hands, and he was a man who had actually been to combat. One question. Vietnam done in the late 70s lacked historical perspective. Films done in the 80s were better. That is from Melissa. I've never been to Vietnam. I kind of leave that, as I said, with there are some people who look at The Deer Hunter and feel like that was their experience. There's people who look at Platoon and say that was their experience. I kind of put that as, I think there is a film that probably will mirror everyone's experience in some way. Oh, Melissa's father called 12 O'Clock High the best wartime film about command. Yeah, that's, if there's one real kind of like bone to pick I have about really the post 9/11 cinema boom and how it's been more about kind of trying to make the next Top Gun, there aren't a lot of movies about military culture. And again, since I experienced that secondhand growing up and still kind of hear about it, for me, I think that's what I find more fascinating. And I'd like to see more movies about kind of that, the minutia of that. There have been some people, I asked another person about that, and he said A Few Good Men is kind of a good example of that. But yeah, there aren't that many films about command anymore versus a lot of the movies in World War II and sort of post that era were about that. We're about the culture and kind of the hierarchy. Which we don't really have anymore. Unfortunately, it is 7:55, so I do have to go. But I'd like to thank everyone for coming. Hopefully, I will see you next month for Footage Not Found, where we will talk about the day the clown cried. I kid you not. Go Google that movie. It exists somewhere, and it's my life goal.
Library of Congress. I did Google it. The Library of Congress apparently has a copy of it. 2024.
Yep, we're Todd, what's your joke about the Criterion offices?
It's the Criterion office probably has a countdown clock going, or at the very least, all the distributors are lined up like it's like a race. See who gets it first.
Yeah, but like I recently read somewhere that the copyright for that is not as cut and dry as we think it is. So I'm like, oh no, there might be a snag. It takes a real special person to be just really, really excited to see an awful film.
Take care. Bye.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I hope you'll have a good night, and I will see you next month.